Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, as we come to the end of the year, I like to discuss the revisionism, the attempts to rewrite history that some people, whether deliberately for political reasons or unintentionally because they just lack critical thinking skills, are taking part in when arguing that the Conservatives should never have removed Boris Johnson. It is certainly true that they messed up the succession very badly, but anyone thinking they'd have been better off sticking with Johnson seems to be forgetting some very important details. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So there are extremists on both the left and right now arguing that the Conservatives would have been better off sticking with Johnson. The Guardian's resident Tory enabler now arguing that the Tories face an extended period in the electoral wilderness due to this decision. But as Jones was part of the strategy team which consigned Labour to its worst post-war electoral defeat, I think we can consider his tactical acumen somewhat lacking, especially when you look at the evidence. I mean, what is it that the Johnson supporters on both the left and the right are looking at? One thing seems to be a mathematically illiterate interpretation of the polling. When Boris Johnson announced his intention to step down, Labour had an 11-point lead on YouGov. Now Labour lead by 24 points. Well, Rishi Sunak's government's even less popular than Boris Johnson's, they say. But this is ridiculous. Like, when you drill down to individual polls, you actually see that the public think that Rishi Sunak is more credible than Boris Johnson. I mean, I feel a little conflicted here, because if the Tories want to engage in infighting over the choice of leader, then all to the good come the next election. That's fine if they want to tear themselves to pieces. But I can't help but feel aggrieved when people are making spurious arguments, whether they work in favour of my political aims or not. So I'm not particularly minded to defend Sunak at all. But when people talk nonsense, I'm not great at keeping my mouth shut. So where the Tories went wrong was not in removing Johnson. It wasn't even in appointing Sunak, although a functioning Conservative Party would surely have had better options. The massive mistake that none of these revisionists seem to want to acknowledge was allowing Liz Truss onto the final ballot. The consequences were inevitable enough. I have to admit that she got on with her insane plan much more quickly than I thought she would. I thought she'd ease herself in a bit. I was surprised by the speed with which she moved. But I knew she was a fantasist, and if I knew she was a fantasist, so must her parliamentary colleagues. Indeed, I think a lot of her support actually came from Boris Johnson backers who knew she would crash and burn and allow the blonde buffoon back again before the election. Now, to be fair to Owen Jones, he's not as deluded as the Tory revisionist. He makes it clear that he's aware that the plight the Conservatives find themselves in is down to not Rishi Sunak, but the hole that Liz Truss blew in the Tories' credibility, to say nothing of the economy. But he also describes her ascent as inevitable once Johnson fell. This is rubbish. In the final round of MPs voting, Sunak won 137 votes, Truss 113, Mordaunt 105. Basically, Sunak's supporters were insufficiently coordinated. Sunak only needed about 120 votes to be absolutely certain of being in the final ballot. Absolutely certain. He had 17 extra votes. If they were carefully coordinated, he could have had supporters lend some to Mordaunt in order to sink Truss. In fact, I strongly suspect a few did go that way, not enough. He had more than enough votes to have put Mordaunt on that final ballot. And this is not as risky an exercise as you may think. It's what Boris Johnson's supporters did in 2019 to see off his main rival, Michael Gove. You know, spare Johnson backers voted for Jeremy Hunt in the final round because they thought party members would back Johnson over Hunt, and they were right about that. But they weren't so sure going up against Gove. But that's looking at it from one point of view. Then there are the other reasons for Johnson's removal. The next was his unremitting attitude to scandals. He boasted about not changing. It would be different if he'd have just recognised that he messed up and at least put on a show of contrition. He never did. In fact, on the rare occasions where he expressed regret, because he never apologised. Saying the word sorry when you don't accept your own failings isn't actually saying sorry. But on the rare occasions when he pretended to, he would immediately go off to the House of Commons bar and say to his own MPs that he was just lying. You know, he was pissing off the public just more and more. Once he'd lost public affection, First with the Owen Paterson scandal and then Partygate. Each subsequent scandal just hardened the public attitude against him. I cannot tell you how strong a message it was to the Tories that they lost North Shropshire in a by-election last year. Something, again, the revisionists don't mention. This was like the executive board at McDonald's voting to stop selling burgers in their outlets. This wasn't just swing voters turning against Johnson. This was lifelong Tory voters doing so as well. So when the more mundane scandals erupted, that Johnson would have charmed his way out of in the past, they were now biting. And consider that they wouldn't have stopped. They wouldn't have ended. If Johnson had still been Prime Minister now, there would have been 2 or 3 further scandals, further revelations. The journalist who broke the Partygate story said that she had more in her back pocket, should it have been needed. There was more that wasn't published. Others will have been keeping revelations ready to be used when necessary as well. This would have carried on, I said at the time, all the way up until the election. People had things that they would have portioned out a bit at a time to keep the spotlight firmly on the unsuitability of Boris Johnson to lead, all the way to the next election. And the longer the Conservatives stuck by him, the more the public would see a party not caring about what they thought of the matter. And then there's the massive elephant in the room. An elephant that none of the revisionists bother to even mention, much less try and excuse away. The Privileges Committee investigation, which is going to find Johnson guilty of breaching the ministerial code in all likelihood. The fact that his own legal defence, being paid for by the taxpayer, is trying to shift the goalposts. They're trying very, very hard to shift the goalposts, to tell the committee what is and is not a ministerial breach. That tells you that they are not confident that he's going to be found innocent. You know, the result of that investigation would be to force Tory MPs into an impossible situation. Before they actually forced him out in early July, it was fairly common knowledge that they knew they were going to have to get rid of him sometime in the autumn. You know, the Chris Pincher scandal just hastened the decision. There was no way they could leave him in place for when the inquiry concluded. No way. I mean, consider the worst case scenario for them, the worst credible case. Now, I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but there is a very credible chance that Johnson will be found guilty. I think that's actually quite likely. But he would still be Prime Minister. The media would publish a lot of juicy revelations. As it is, they may not now because he's just a backbencher. But consider that both the Sue Gray and the Met police ran a very lacklustre investigation, themselves, because they couldn't be arsed with the political heat from the affair. Privileges Committee, no, they've got a job to do. They are investigating properly. They won't investigate all the things the Met should have done because they're not investigating whether he broke the law. They're investigating whether he lied on 4 specific occasions. Details are going to come out that were not known about before, in public anyway. If Johnson was still Prime Minister, it would be of heightened public interest compared to now to report on them. The public would renew their outrage over Partygate. The Tories would look even worse for continuing to excuse the behaviour and stick by Johnson. The permanent damage to the party's reputation would grow. Then consider the punishment. If the committee recommended a suspension of sufficient length to justify a recall petition, and I don't know whether they will, they may not, but if they do, and there's a credible chance they will, a chance too great for the Tories to risk it, it is hard to see Tory MPs voting it down. You may think, well, they'll vote it down. They can vote it down. If they were prepared to vote down the punishment, which would be very damaging in public, they would have been prepared to vote down the inquiry itself. That would have been much easier. They weren't prepared to sink the inquiry, which would have been less costly in terms of votes. So they will have to accept the recommendation of remedial action. And the recall petition would succeed. Absolutely, it would succeed. So Johnson would no longer be an MP. That would be it. Yes, he could stand in the by-election. That would be weeks later. And he would lose it. You know, if he can lose a seat that the Tories have had since Napoleon was knocking about, he could lose his own much more marginal seat. But win or lose wouldn't matter that much. For a period of several weeks at least, the Prime Minister would not be an elected Member of Parliament, or indeed any sort of parliamentarian. Another constitutional car crash from the Tories, which would have added another unprecedented scandal to their tally of offences. And if Johnson lost the by-election anyway, and he would, that would be that. And that would mean the Tories would then have to act incredibly quickly, because then they've got a Prime Minister who's not just not a Member of Parliament, but not going to be one. They'd have to act so quickly it would massively have increased the risk of ending up with someone like Liz Truss replacing him and doing what she did. I know they ended up doing that anyway, but that was because they were stupid. Tory MPs should have taken control of the process for the contest to replace Johnson, just as they did to replace Truss. They should have identified that the party members keep picking the wrong one. They were complacent and they paid the price. But it's that complacency that cost them not removing Johnson. I've said before, I don't think Sunak is a good politician. But if they'd replaced Johnson with Sunak immediately, he would have closed the gap with Labour. In fact, at the time of Johnson's fall, I suggested that the gap would close in the autumn, as the replacement would only need to not be Boris Johnson. Just ease themselves in, don't do anything controversial, just be stable, don't bring the scandals, don't be Boris Johnson. But that they would run into trouble during the winter. In fact, I was foreseeing a situation where people, the anti-Tory crowd, would go loopy at Labour because the gap would close right up and they'd lose their minds. And it'd be like, no, just hold on. Winter 2023, it'll swing back. The Tory chicken is going to come home to roost. But as it was, Sunak ended up becoming PM with Labour with a 37-point lead, not an 11-point lead, a 37-point lead. And the economy in such ruin that even ordinary members of the public could see it. The media could do nothing to hide it. The mistake the Tories made was not being serious about winning the next election. They're still making the same mistake now, really. Many of those who might ordinarily argue for a more pragmatic approach seem to be resigned to losing, and they've given up the fight. And I also think they've got a particular problem, that because so many of their MPs are inexperienced, the 2019 intake may think, well, we've been MPs for a few years now, we know what's going on. No, you don't. You've got no idea what's going on. Most of them are just too inexperienced to understand how to coordinate amongst themselves for the good of their party. So what's happened now is mostly it's the swivel-eyed loons driving things. But in the real world, the Tories had no option to stick with Johnson. There wasn't, would they have been better with Johnson? There was no option to do that. To suggest otherwise is to completely ignore what was happening when he was at the helm and what would now be happening had he continued. That the Tories looked to be in worse shape now than when Johnson was in place was because they had not worked out a serious plan to replace him. Unforgivable, because his days were numbered as soon as he lost North Shropshire. That was the sign. That was Tory voters telling the Tory party to elbow their leader. It was 7 months before he finally fell. Plenty of time to have engineered a transition to a credible replacement. You'll notice when Truss went, they took control then. They made sure that their pick got in then. They could have done that the first time round, but they messed it up. What we have right now is a parliamentary Conservative Party incapable of thinking strategically. In which case, no leader is likely to be able to turn it into an election-winning machine. So they may as well go with the man who is seen by the public as out of touch, but at least not insane. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.